The pen was in my hand. I was seconds away from signing over controlling interest in my $20 million logistics empire. Then I saw it. On the digital proxy form, the designated silent partner wasn't me. It was Heather Diane Crawford, my mother-in-law. Tyler wouldn't meet my eyes. He just kept spinning his wedding ring, his boyish charm replaced by a nervous, twitching smile. "Just sign, honey," he whispered. "It's for the family office. We can sort the details at dinner." But I'm not stupid. I realized in that second that my husband and his mother weren't just partners, they were parasites who had been waiting 7 years to drain the host dry. If you discovered your partner had built a backdoor into your life's work, would you confront them immediately, or would you stay quiet until you held all the leverage? I laid the pen down on the mahogany table. The sound was small, but in the silence of the boardroom, it felt like a gavel, striking. I had dismissed both legal teams for a private family session before the final ink hit the paper, a request Tyler and Heather had happily granted, thinking it was their chance to finish the manipulation in private. I didn't look at Tyler yet. I knew if I saw the calculated concern in his eyes, I might do something uncharacteristic, like scream. Instead, I tapped the screen of the iPad. "There's a biometric sync error," I said. My voice was level, clinical, the same tone I used to tell board members their projections were off by 40%. As the holder of supervoting Class B shares, I possessed the unilateral power to veto any transfer, though I preferred to let Tyler believe he was still in the game until the trap was set. I've learned that true power doesn't react. It gathers data. By stalling, I wasn't being difficult. I was becoming a ghost in my own machine. I caught the shift in Tyler's posture out of the corner of my eye. His shoulders dropped 2 inches, and the frantic spinning of his wedding ring stopped. He actually let out a long, slow breath. It was a micro payoff, a small, physical confession of guilt that he didn't even realize he was making. He thought he had a few more minutes to rehearse his lies. He probably thought I was just being my usual, meticulous self. "The security protocols for a transfer of this size are sensitive," I continued, finally meeting Heather's appraising gaze. "I need to check the local server logs. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Heather's smile was as stiff as her starched linen suit. "Of course, dear," she said. She used that word dear like a leash she was slowly tightening. We wouldn't want any mistakes with $20 million on the line. I walked out of the room without another word. The transition was physical. The air in the hallway was warmer, still carrying the faint, lingering scent of Tyler's sandalwood cologne, the one I'd bought him for his 34th birthday. But as I entered the server room at the end of the hall, the atmosphere turned cold and sterile. It smelled of ozone and recycled air. It was a workspace I'd built from the ground up, but today, it felt like a crime scene. I locked the door and pulled out my personal phone. I didn't call my attorney. I called Elias, my lead developer. "Elias, I need an emergency metadata scan on the proxy filings," I said. "Check the digital tripwire I flagged last quarter. The silent proxy should be right where we suspected. Look for unauthorized redirects or silent partner tags. Do it now." While I waited, I watched the blinking blue lights of the server racks. I'd spent 15 years building this empire, working 70-hour weeks while Tyler played the role of the supportive husband. I can admit now that part of me saw the patterns earlier than I wanted to, but I'd chosen to call it family office planning instead of theft. Elias came back on the line 3 minutes later. His voice was hushed, almost frightened. "Madison, I found it. There's a quiet proxy active on your private server. It's been siphoning operational data and intellectual property for 18 months. It's redirecting to an external cloud account registered to a holding company." I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the server room's temperature. 18 months. He hadn't just been waiting for the sign-off. He'd been looting the vault while I slept next to him. I knew the sound of financial fear. In our house in Naperville during the 1990s, my parents never used the word no. They used "we'll see," which was a polite way of saying the bank account was empty. I decided very early that I would never live in a house that hummed with that specific brand of anxiety. I traded my entire 20s for a logistics algorithm that could predict a global supply chain collapse before a single ship ever left a port. It wasn't just the logistics firm. It was a high-margin SaaS platform, a digital brain that the industry's biggest players were already desperate to license. Scholarships through Northwestern, an MBA at Kellogg, and 3 years at McKinsey provided the armor I needed to enter the arena. I also had my lawyers draft an ironclad prenuptial agreement long before Tyler and I ever said "I do," a standard operating procedure for a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. By the time I turned 30, I wasn't just surviving. I was the primary investor in my own sovereignty. Then I met Tyler at a fundraiser for the Lincoln Park Zoo. He stood by the penguin exhibit with a glass of champagne, looking like a man who had never known the weight of a utility bill. He was the Hollow Prince, charming, light, and seemingly unburdened by the competitive drive that defined every other man in my professional circle. He told me he was proud of my success and that I was a powerhouse. Only later did I understand what that moment of pride really meant. I thought he was offering me a partnership, but he was actually performing a feasibility study on a potential acquisition. At the time, I viewed his mother Heather's coldness as a remnant of some fading social hierarchy. I mistook her appraising stares over Wedgwood china for old-world high society charm. We often file away red flags as tradition when we are hungry for the feeling of belonging somewhere that isn't a spreadsheet. I was a logistics expert who had missed the most critical redirect in my own life. I believed Tyler wanted to be a Mitchell because he valued the team we were building. The reality was that I was simply the highest performing asset in the Crawford family office portfolio. Every slow dance in our kitchen, every Sunday night we spent making bolognese to old Motown records, was a transaction I didn't know I was funding. While I was counting my blessings, he was counting the equity in my Series B funding. I can admit now that I wanted the family legacy they promised so badly that I didn't check the fine print on the people offering it. I thought I was finally resting. I was really being trained to accept a quiet exploitation under the guise of marital unity. The silence in our townhouse was no longer peaceful. It was tactical. Tyler spent the next 48 hours performing the role of the repentant husband, a performance that cost him several bouquets of white lilies and 3 hours of manufactured deep conversation. He suggested a celebratory weekend at the Crawford Estates, the family winery in Napa Valley. He claimed we needed to reset, to find our rhythm again before the Series B funding finalized. I agreed because I needed to see their base of operations. I needed to understand exactly what my siphoned capital was sustaining. The Crawford Estates was a monument to a legacy that had long since outrun its bank account. The main house was a sprawling 19th century structure that required more maintenance than its production could ever justify. As a logistics expert, I couldn't help but notice the inefficiencies, the aging equipment, the skeleton crew, and the overstocked inventory of unsellable vintages. Heather greeted us on the terrace, draped in a silk scarf and 1980s elegance. She looked every bit the matriarch, but my eyes were now trained on the metadata of her life. I noticed the slight fraying at the edges of her designer rug, and the way she checked the label on the wine Tyler poured as if she were surprised we were drinking the reserve labels. What stayed with me wasn't the argument. It was the way she looked at my business like it was a crop she was finally ready to harvest. During dinner, the manipulation turned into a formal proposal. "Madison, we've been thinking about the future," Heather said, her voice smooth as aged port. "With the new funding, your firm will be a target for every predatory litigation firm in the valley. For the sake of the Crawford name, we should restructure your assets under a heritage trust. It would protect you. It would ensure that what you've built stays within the family sanctuary." I recognized the move immediately. Classic financial gaslighting wrapped in the scent of expensive perfume, designed to make me feel small in the shadow of that's when I realized, designed to make me feel small in the shadow of their so-called legacy. It was a calculated eclipse. That's when I realized that some forms of entitlement stay invisible until you stop cooperating. Heather didn't think she was stealing. She believed she was curating a wealth that I was too new to manage properly. This was the architecture of entitlement by proxy, the psychological phenomenon where a fading elite believes they are owed the success of a newcomer simply for providing the pedigree to house it. I looked at the pearls around her neck. In the low light of the candles, I could see they were high-quality replicas. The Crawford dynasty wasn't just fading. It was already insolvent. My $20 million wasn't a family office investment. It was a life support system for a corpse. Tyler reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It makes sense, babe. One less thing for you to worry about." His touch felt like a cold calculation. I looked at him and smiled the same empty, professional smile I give to competitors I'm about to put out of business. "I'll review the trust documents on Monday," I said. I had already authorized a silent audit of their winery's debt. By the time dessert arrived, I knew they owed $15 million to creditors who were 2 weeks away from a foreclosure notice. I spent that night in a guest wing. The guest room smelled of lavender and old secrets. At 3 a.m., I sat on the floor, my laptop screen glowing as the ghost firm sent through the final forensic recovery files. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, every percentage point a brick removed from the foundation of my marriage. They found the home equity line of credit on our townhouse authorized by a signature that looked like mine, but carried the mechanical precision of a forgery. $300,000, drawn down to zero and funneled through 6 installments into Crawford Family Holdings. He'd managed to bypass the notary requirement by using a mobile notary service while I was on a high-stakes call with a client in Singapore, likely a friend who didn't bother to verify the second signature. He had also set up a digital mail forwarding filter through my private server, ensuring all bank notifications regarding the line of credit were archived in a hidden folder before I could ever see them. The cost of this silent audit was the psychological tax of remaining still while my world was being dissected. I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating, and I had been a very cooperative target. I had to lie in that bed later, feeling Tyler's rhythmic breathing beside me, knowing he wasn't my partner, but a spy who had been documenting my vulnerabilities for 7 years. True power doesn't break under betrayal. It simply updates its ledger. Then the lead technician flagged a hidden directory on Tyler's cloud drive. It wasn't titled Taxes or Logistics. It was titled Project Madison. I opened it and found a roadmap of our entire relationship, starting 6 months before we ever met. There were spreadsheets ranking my company's intellectual property potential against other female founders in the Bay Area. I wasn't a choice of the heart. I was a Series B acquisition. What stayed with me wasn't the theft of the money. It was the realization that even the butterflies I felt during our first date had been part of a rehearsed script. Years later, that detail still feels sharper than the rest. I've spent 7 years being the silent investor in their version of family, while they were managing me as a high-yield asset that was finally reaching its expiration date. I realized then that a legacy isn't built on what you share, it's built on what you refuse to let others touch. I closed the laptop and watched the sun begin to rise over the Napa vineyards. The light was beautiful, but to me it was clinical. I didn't need to cry anymore. I had enough data to start the liquidation of the Crawford family name. I invited them to the boardroom of the winery. The tasting room at the Crawford Estates was circular, designed to make guests feel at the center of the world, but today I had repurposed it as a theater of accountability. Heather and Tyler sat across from me, their expressions expectant, fully believing they were about to witness the final surrender of my logistics empire. I had set up a large projector, the white screen casting a stark, artificial light against the centuries-old wood-paneled walls. "I've spent the last 48 hours doing what I do best," I said, my voice as cold as the stainless steel tanks in the fermentation room. I found the bleeding. I hit a key on my laptop, and a list of $15 million in debt appeared: every banknote, every overdue supplier, and every tax lien filed against the Crawford estates. Heather's hand went to her replica pearls, her eyes widening as the numbers scrolled past. "You were right, Heather," I continued, leaning back in my chair. "A legacy isn't built by one person. It's also not saved by one." I let the silence hang for exactly 5 seconds before delivering the blow I had spent 48 hours engineering. I triggered a buyout clause through a distressed debt fund I've been tracking since the first red flag appeared. I leveraged my Series B commitment letters as collateral to secure the capital, turning the very investment Tyler tried to steal into the hammer that would crush him. I structured the bridge loan against my personal secondary equity, ensuring that not a single cent of the company's operational capital was diverted, keeping my fiduciary duty to my new partners spotless. I bought the debt, all of it. As of 9 a.m. this morning, I am the sole owner of every note on this property. I am effectively your landlord. But I wasn't just buying leverage, I was buying the dirt. The real estate value of this winery alone is worth triple the debt if it's repurposed for luxury development, a move my logistics data confirmed months ago. Only now can I admit that confrontation is often a tool for the weak. Procedural extraction is the weapon of the sovereign. When you fight with words, you give the other person the luxury of a rebuttal. When you fight with ownership, the debate is already over. Heather tried to speak, but her mouth just worked soundlessly like a fish pulled from the water. Tyler finally looked up, his face a mask of panicked realization as he saw his mother's composure dissolve. "But we aren't done," I said. I opened the directory titled Project Madison and let our entire marriage fill the screen. The ranking systems, the intellectual property potential scores, the recruitment dates, it was a digital map of a 7-year betrayal. I watched the sweat break out on Tyler's forehead as his own comments about my acquisition value were displayed for his mother to see. I didn't feel anger. I felt the satisfaction of a ledger finally balanced. I slid a voluntary exit agreement across the table. "This document outlines your immediate resignation from my life and my business," I stated, my tone clinical. "I also have a signed criminal affidavit detailing your bank fraud on the HELOC. If you don't sign, it goes to the district attorney by noon. In exchange, I won't move for immediate foreclosure on this winery today." Heather looked at the check I had voided on the screen, then at the crushing weight of the $15 million she now owed me. Her dynasty hadn't just hit a wall. It had been reclaimed by the person she thought she was harvesting. They were economically decapitated within the hour. There was no cinematic arrest, no flashing lights, and no handcuffs, just the heavy, suffocating silence of $15 million in debt. In the world of high-status families like the Crawfords, a prison cell is almost a mercy compared to a public audit. Real revenge isn't watching someone rot in a cell. It's watching them lose the only currency they ever truly valued, their social standing. Tyler and Heather were left with their sprawling, crumbling winery and a mountain of interest payments that made their heritage feel like a tombstone. Heather sat paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the void watermark over the proxy agreement. The Crawford name, which she had protected like a religious relic, was now legally synonymous with insolvency. She had spent decades appraising others, only to realize that she was the one who had been bankrupt from the beginning. Tyler moved out of our townhouse and into a dilapidated guest cottage on the winery grounds, a space usually reserved for seasonal pickers. It was a fitting exile. He went from being a Mitchell to a ghost haunting the edges of a failing estate. Looking back at the wreckage, it became clear that the most effective cage isn't made of iron, it's made of the choices we can't afford to undo. I finalized the voluntary exit agreement with the same precision I used for my logistics audit. It wasn't about being vindictive. It was about ensuring the host was finally free of the parasite. The social fallout was a quiet, relentless erosion. In Napa, people don't yell when you fail. They simply stop inviting you. The country club memberships were quietly not renewed, and the charity boards Heather had chaired for 20 years replaced her within a month. The legal process took months, reflecting the slow, grinding machinery of wealth extraction. There were no instant victories. I had to let go of the winery's initial stolen investment, the $2 million Tyler had funneled through the years to ensure a clean break. It was an expensive lesson, but in the realm of sovereignty, some losses are simply the price of admission. By the end of the 4th month, the Crawford family office was a shell, and I was the one holding the keys to the only remaining assets that mattered. I watched it happen with the detachment of a neutral observer. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a correction. Their version of family had been a subscription I was the only one paying for, and I had simply let the term expire. Sovereign Logistics. The new letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 months after I walked away from that boardroom table in Palo Alto. I sat in my new office in the West Loop, watching the gray rain streak against the glass. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I had spent 7 years believing that my success was only valid if it was housed within a family name that felt like an ancient sanctuary. I realized now that the sanctuary was a facade, and the family name was just a brand I had been paying for with my own autonomy. Rebranding my firm was not an act of revenge. It was a necessary act of accounting. I promoted 2 of my senior directors, people who had actually pulled the all-nighters with me during the Hartfield contract, to full partners. Real partners this time, people who earned their stake through labor rather than through a marriage certificate. We are no longer Mitchell and Associates, a name Tyler tried to colonize. We are a sovereign entity. My credit score has climbed back to 820. My new condo is half the size of the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, but every square inch of it belongs to me. There is only one name on the deed. Madison Mitchell. I still go to therapy every Thursday at 4. It turns out that siphoning millions of dollars from a company is a technical problem with a legal solution, but siphoning trust from a life is a psychological fracture that requires a much slower repair. I am learning to trust my own patterns again, the internal algorithm that warned me about Heather's appraising eyes and Tyler's too perfect smile years before I was willing to listen. I can admit now that part of me saw the truth during that first lunch over Wedgwood China, but I chose the comfort of the lie because I was tired of being the only one holding my world together. My parents still visit from Naperville once a month. My mother always brings her homemade banana bread, and my father spends the afternoon fixing the drawer slides in my kitchen because that is how he shows love. He shows it with utility, not with acquisitions. They don't mention the Crawfords. They don't have to. The $15 million in debt I left Heather and Tyler with is a more effective barrier than any restraining order. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Heather had to sell her vintage jewelry to cover the first quarter of interest payments on the winery. The silver bob is still perfectly styled, I'm told, even as the walls of her empire turn to dust. Tyler writes to me from the guest cottage on the winery grounds sometimes. He still uses the embossed Mitchell stationery, a desperate attempt to cling to the identity he thought would be his retirement plan. I don't open the letters. There is nothing he can say that isn't another line in a script he stopped rehearsing months ago. He isn't my husband anymore. He is a lesson I learned at the cost of 7 years and a very expensive education in the architecture of entitlement. Looking back at the wreckage, I realized that some losses are simply the price of admission to your own life. Sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is their rejection. It is a brutal, necessary catalyst that forces you to stop asking for permission to be powerful. It forces you to build a foundation so fortified that no one can touch it without your explicit authorization. I don't look for hollow princes anymore. I look for consistency. I look for the people who don't need to be the center of my world to value being part of it. I don't dance to Motown in the kitchen anymore. I listen to the silence of my own house. And for the first time, it doesn't sound empty. It sounds like control. It sounds like the sovereignty of page 17. One moment of paying attention, one refusal to just sign and pay is all that stands between a life of labor and a life of ownership. Have you ever experienced a moment in your own life where a single detail or document revealed a truth you weren't ready to see? What would you have done in my place? Would you have chosen a louder confrontation? Or is the quiet peace of absolute control enough? I would really like to hear your perspective.